Thank you, Lena, for that kind introduction. Hi, everyone. Good morning and good evening, wherever you are. We're really thrilled to be here to share some of our work on citation integrity. My name is Halil Kilicoglu, as Lena introduced, and I'll be presenting with my colleague, Jodi Schneider. So again, I don't want to repeat what Lena just said. We're both at associate professors at School of Information Sciences at Illinois, and Jodi is currently on sabbatical in Boston. So you've probably heard a lot about research integrity, but why should we care about citation integrity, which we think is a vital part of research integrity? As I think we can all agree, citations have a crucial role in construction and evolution of scientific knowledge. So for trustworthy and reliable science, we also need our citations to be accurate. Citations are also, of course, widely used for research assessment to measure the scholarly contributions of a journal or researchers. However, despite this central role that they play in research and science, citations are often overlooked in science, and there's really very little accountability for citations, which has led to many questionable research practices around citations, including citation padding, citation stacking, citation cartels, and so on. And we feel that part of this has to do with education about citations, how to accurately cite things. And based on our observations and others' observations, we think that citation integrity is a vital part of research integrity. Jodi, do you want to take over?
Right. So as Halil mentioned, there are lots of types of questionable research practices and consequences around citations. We've pulled a few examples. One is that inaccurate citations can be harmful to health. You see in front of you the discussion about how the opioid epidemic was potentially impacted by the 5-sentence letter published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980. So that was the evidence that that we had as of 1980 that addiction was rare with long-term opioid therapy. Of course, that's not the case. Lots of consequences of that. And so that would be one example of the problems that come from loose citation practices. Citation cartels, which is also called citation stacking. This is another issue that we've seen in the news. So here we see an image about citation stacking, where 4 Brazilian journals published review articles that were instead of citing their own journals, which was used to be something very easy to spot, they were citing each other's journals in order to raise impact factor. So they did. Their 2011 impact factors got raised, but ultimately they were suppressed from having an impact factor when this was noticed. And this sort of I'll pat your back, you'll pat mine kind of citation is an example of something we think is problematic. Next. Fake citations have been in the news quite a lot recently, especially as generative AI has become more popular, and more popular also, unfortunately, in writing research sometimes. So for instance, here are some carbon capture references provided by ChatGPT. They look utterly plausible. They've got authors who are real authors. They've got journals that are real journals, titles that are plausible, but they're fabricated. And of course, this is not just ChatGPT, but any kind of generative AI has fake citations that can result. And one of the silver linings, of course, is this can be one way to detect AI-generated content at times. So as we say, citation integrity is really this vital part, needs additional examination at this point. So we'll tell you, the next slide, I guess, we'll tell you about these recent research projects that we're doing, and I'll turn it back to Halil to talk about your natural language processing.
Yes, so we're going to be talking about two projects that we've been working on last couple of years. I'm the lead on the natural language processing to assess and improve citation integrity in Biomedical Publications project funded by the Office of Research Integrity. And Jodi will talk about her project on reducing the inadvertent spread of retracted science funded by Sloan Foundation. So thinking about citations in biomedicine, this is one domain where citations have been studied quite a lot, and found that there were a lot of issues in how citations are done in biomedical science. There are many studies that show that a significant number of citations are wrong, essentially. And that's partly because citations are rarely examined for accuracy in peer review or the journal submission process. They're difficult to do. And there are generally two types of errors, citations errors, that are being discussed. The first type is metadata errors. These are errors in things like author names or dates or page numbers. Another type of error is what's often called the quotation errors. These refer to cases where the author is not accurately representing the content of the cited paper. The second type of error, the quotation errors, are especially pernicious because they're difficult to detect unless the reader is closely familiar with the content of the reference paper. So unless it's you who's being miscited, it might be hard to catch this. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who has seen this happening with our work. Somebody else is citing your work, and it's actually not what you are saying in your paper. And there's some meta-analysis work that has been done, and one specific study by Jurgis estimates that 25% of medical articles contain quotation errors, and half of them severe that affect sort of the findings of the citing paper. And there's also work by Stephen Greenberg from 2009, in which he showed that citation distortions and biases have led to some unfounded claims to be accepted as beliefs in Alzheimer's disease research. So the focus of this project was on quotation errors. And just to sort of exemplify this type of error, let's take this example here. The citation is saying this is coherent with the fact that human angiotensin converting enzyme 2 expression were not observed in the gut of the mice used in that study, and having the citation to another paper. And when we look at that paper, we see that what's being said is actually the opposite of that. HAC2 was expressed most abundantly in the colon. This is what we call this type of a contradiction error, a specific type of quotation error. And our idea was, well, can we use NLP to identify this kind of citation accuracy errors? And this is motivated by the fact that assessing the citations for accuracy requires considerable manual effort. And if you want to really fix things, we want to do this P-publication. And this is just not very feasible. Often the journals, editors, they don't have a lot of resources to do this, or peer reviewers. And NLP techniques could support tools for citation accuracy checking by basically looking at the cited paper, and assessing whether there's a mismatch there. And if it finds such a mismatch, we can flag those citations for closer scrutiny by a human. And by doing this at large scale, we can also trace the provenance of misleading claims and possible misinformation in science as well. See where a particular claim, for example, comes from. Looking at the root of that issue, we might be able to identify some bigger issues. And such tools can support journals' workflows. If authors know that journals are checking for such errors, it can raise some more awareness about citation errors. And it can also just, doing this at large scale can also support meta-research studies as well. To be able to develop NLP models for this task, we need data, and that's not available, unfortunately, even though there are a lot of studies that looked at different medical specialties. There's no publicly available data. So our work basically started by annotating a corpus of articles for citation accuracy. We took 100 highly cited PMC, PubMed Central articles, and about 20 to 30 on average citations to each of these papers, and labeled them for whether they're accurate or they have errors. And then we use that data set to train AI models to recognize such errors, with the ultimate goal of creating a database of citation errors and providing essentially just kind of a graph citation network where we also specify errors or accuracy. We used to categorize the citation quotation errors. We use categorizations that were used in some meta-analysis studies. So often citation errors are categorized as being major errors or minor errors. Contradiction, the example that I showed earlier, is considered a major error. Irrelevant, not substantiated, would also be considered major errors. On the other hand, minor errors include things like misquotes, misquoting numbers, or basically citing work, citing not the right, basically oversimplifying the findings of the work. And also something called etiquette. This is something we came up with in this study. This is not often discussed in the literature. And etiquette error is one where basically the context of the citation is not entirely clear. So it's not entirely clear what's being cited from the reference paper. And we call those etiquette errors. We had graduate and undergraduate students in life sciences doing the annotation for us. So as I said, we annotated 100 reference articles with more than 3,000 citations to these articles. And we found that there were 1,200 errors. That accounts for about 39% of the citations. So this is a little higher than what's typically reported in the literature, but we attribute that to the fact that we're also annotating etiquette errors, which were generally not considered. Without that, it's about 26%. And about less than half of those errors were considered major, and a little more than half of those were considered minor errors. And after that annotation, we developed NLP models for that. Our typical pipeline for NLP was 3 steps. First, given a citing paper and a particular citation, we identify this context around that citation that discusses the reference paper. So that was our first step. In the second step, based on that context, citation context, we retrieved evidence sentences from the original reference article. So we're basically looking at similarity to identify those. And then once we identified these evidence sentences, we're basically putting them all together and using a model to categorize them as being accurate, not accurate, or irrelevant. We basically consolidated all the error labels that we have, except irrelevant, together, since our initial preliminary experiments show that with relatively small number of errors for some of the types, it was hard to distinguish some of these inaccurate citations. And for the first step, we basically tried a couple of methods. We simply, as a baseline, we simply use a citation sentence as a context. And we also fine-tuned a BERT model to identify the context around the citation marker. And for retrieving evidence sentences, we use sort of standard information retrieval methods. BM25 is a well-known method that uses overlap of words, essentially. So we use that to retrieve top 60 sentences from the original article. And then we use the Mono T5 re-ranker, which basically takes those sentences and re-ranks them in the order of importance to identify a smaller number of relevant evidence sentences. And then we put them together using, and then we use the claim verification framework to classify them as being accurate or having errors. So this was a well-known, Multiverse is a well-known claim verification model. In addition to this, we fine-tune this model on our data. In addition to this, we also use in-context learning using GPT models as a comparison as well. And using this multiverse model, which was our main model, these were the results that we obtained. Our best results came with using 20 top sentences from the reference articles with accuracy, and these are F1 scores, and F1 score is a sort of a harmonic mean between precision and recall, and precision being positive predictive value and recall being sensitivity. So for accuracy, for identifying accurate citations, the score was 0.69. We did not do so well with not accurate or irrelevant citations, about 40%. And overall, our micro F1, so average of F1 scores for all these three labels were 0.52. We also used, excuse me, as a baseline, just using title and abstract of the reference article. That gave us lower results as we were expecting. And the goal here shows basically when we had the perfect citation context and perfect evidences as annotated, when we use that to do the classification, we had better results, but still with not accurate label, we were not doing all that great. And comparing it to GPT 2.5 and 4 models, GPT-4 did better with accurate, but really failed at not accurate. So it wasn't good at recognizing the erroneous citations. So it was basically predicting most of the things to be accurate. So it doesn't really reach the performance of the fine-tuned multiverse model. I also have to give this with a caveat that these experiments were done mostly last year. So with newer, more powerful models, we can expect better results. This is ongoing work, but some of the sort of the takeaways from the work we've done. First of all, the data set that we annotated is the first publicly available citation quotation error data set. We found this annotation to be quite challenging because a lot of the citations are kind of subtle and it's not terribly explicit in a lot of cases. And extensive domain knowledge is needed. So we actually had our students read these articles very carefully, the reference articles very carefully, and summarize them before we can ask them to do the annotation. Even then, it was still very challenging to do this. And LP models are not currently, their performance are not good enough really for practical use, especially because we want to be able to recognize the error cases, and the performance for those is still relatively low, but we're doing more work at this time. We're trying to identify citation contexts with more precision. We're augmenting LLM methods, large language model-based methods that we have with retrieval augmented generation. So as an alternative to the information retrieval approach that we were taking, we're trying to annotate more data automatically using data augmentation to account for the fact that our data set, even though it's it's the first, it's still relatively small, and especially some error cases, error types do not have a lot of representation. And finally, if we get to a point where our models are sufficiently good, or we deem them to be sufficiently good, we want to process the PubMed Central citations. So citations in PubMed Central that cite other papers in PubMed Central, we want to first process them and basically provide that as a possible resource for the community. So with that, I'll give the microphone to Jodi again.
Thanks, Halil. I'm going to talk about the Reducing the Inadvertent Spread of Retracted Science project, which has been funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And to this audience, it's probably redundant to say that retraction is intended to correct the literature when there are such serious flaws that the findings and conclusions can't be relied on. So next slide. What this project has largely been concerned with is how do we make sure that people notice when work is retracted, and maybe we need to cite it, right? I cite retracted papers as someone studying them, but we don't want to inadvertently cite. One of the problems is that it's very difficult on publisher websites to find out that materials are retracted. Some colleagues looked at challenges in discovering the retracted status of an article and pointed out in, say, scientific reports, you see that on the left, this article is retracted, you see in red. So then maybe you'd expect when an article is retracted, you'd see a little warning yield notice, and this was retracted, but indeed you do not. On the right, this is also an article that's been retracted. You have to wade through an addendum was published, and then it looks exactly the same. A retraction of this article was published. So inconsistent notification styles are one of the problems. Next. And in fact, we find that people do continually cite retracted papers in ways that do not suggest that they know about the retractions. In January 2021, Charles Piller wrote about this for Science. They did some investigative journalism, looked at 200 post-retraction citations to the Surgisphere retractions from Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine. Over half inappropriately cited the retracted articles. You might say over half, that's terrible. Over half in this space is wonderful because people have found a range, and usually, unless there's been a lot of publicity, there's quite a lot of citation that appears to be inadvertent. Next. So one of the cases that I've studied, we published about this in 2020. At that point, there'd been 11 years of post-retraction citation to a chest article that was retracted because the data was falsified. So this was a randomized controlled trial that was the nutrition study, only thing that could be cited for exactly that purpose. And in that case, 96% of the citations that we could find were inappropriate and showed no awareness of the retraction. And we traced these into the methods and the citations that looked at the methods and the results. It was really, really problematic. Next. So this is just a graph of what that looks like at the second generation. So the black there is the chest article that was retracted, and the blue is the direct citations. And then many of those have these little red citations, these indirect citations, just the next generation. And that's just 1 year's worth of indirect citations. So there's this potential spread where there is potentially, well, there's certainly epistemic risk that's happening, right? As we're moving this information further and further into the literature. And that epistemic risk is something I've been particularly concerned with. Next. Then we said, well, okay, well, that's N of 1. Nobody really cares. But we looked at PubMed Central and got all the citations to retracted papers as of the time that we were pulling the data, and there were not quite 8,000 retracted papers in PubMed, 13,000 post-retraction citations. 94% of those inappropriately cited the retracted article. So that what we saw in that first case is, on average, what's happening in the biomedical literature, at least. And this is, the database-wide perspective that by looking at citation contexts, we can see. Next. And these citations, they just look like normal citations. A study in rats confirmed this treatment can achieve a faster wound healing rate. No, don't cite a retracted paper for that, right? Or to date, only one human study has demonstrated something. Please don't cite a retracted paper for that, right? These are really just look like they're normal citations to, things that are upheld as far as we know, but it's not the case, right? So this is really, really problematic and unfortunately really typical. So next. So this is the advisory board for the RISRS 2020 project. What we did first was run some online meetings getting together people from across all the different parts of the community. We could think of funders, editors, peer reviewers, authors, publishers, database providers, research integrity officers, science journalists. And we tried to understand through a series of interviews and the meetings and literature review what could shift this. So next. And citation analysis, right? So with this sort of stakeholder consultation and environment scan, next I'll show you what we came up with. So on the next slide, we see the recommendations that we came up with. The link at the bottom there is to the white paper. This then, thanks to suggestions from folks we wrote up for research integrity and peer review. And so, so fundamentally, what did we think could shift the situation? One is cross-industry approach for public availability of consistent, standardized, interoperable, timely information about retractions. That is moving. That's moved an enormous amount since we did this. I was really, like dream come true when Crossref made the Retraction Watch database. They ransomed it, made it openly available for 5 years, and hopefully we'll continue to do that. So that's starting to make better information, though we'll look later at the consistency. There's a need for a taxonomy of retraction categories, classifications. And here I'm not talking about, people have proposed some really detailed classifications, but even things like withdrawal. What is a withdrawal in the literature? There is not agreement among publishers about what that means, about what, these different, so some really, really basic taxonomy and then metadata. And there's a little bit of movement on that. Best practices for coordinating the retraction process. I think there's great awareness of the need. Retraction Watch was just writing about, someone who spent 6 years trying to get their own publication retracted. This should not take the amount of time it does. And then part of what we are doing here, I think, is giving you some ammunition for educating the stakeholders you're in touch with about what sort of things there could be in publication, correction, retraction, and all sorts of things. So those are the recommendations that came out. One of the amazing things that happened was a standards organization got interested midway through, before the recommendations were even completely out the door. We presented about this at the NISO Plus meeting, and NISO, the National Information Standards Organization in the US, gathers together people in libraries and publishing and information industry. And a group of people worked for about 1.5 years to put together a standard, right? It's a recommended practices, but it's called for, what could we do about communications of retractions, removals, and expressions of concern. And so now the publishing industry has some checklists when you are retracting something, not why should you retract, right? COPE has got that covered, and so on. But what happens to the metadata? How do you share the information? How do you get it to indexers? How do you get it to search engines and so on? So that just came out in June 2024. Really excited that that's happened. Okay, so next I want to say, as I mentioned, there's this issue about consistency, right? So in the early research that I did, we found that if we looked at one article, it was very difficult to get to the retraction notice. So now we're doing that again at a database-wide level. This is the preprint that's working its way through the process. Is at the bottom. So retraction indexing, right? So some databases allow you to search for retracted publications, and they have a category for that has these sort of checkboxes. Okay, so we're looking at consistency of retraction indexing when it's this sort of category. Go next. And unfortunately, there is really substantial disagreement. So we cannot tell what is retracted, right? We don't know that. What we do know is when we looked across the 11 sources at the bottom here, across them, there are 85,000 items with DOIs or with PMIDs that at least one source asserts is retracted. So we take that as our universe and say, all right, purportedly these are retracted. They might be, they might not be. Do other sources agree? Well, sometimes they don't actually cover, right? The orange here is there's just differences. If you're GeoRef, you're covering the geological stuff. If you're PubMed, you're covering the medical stuff, right? So you may not have the same items. So you get a pass for that. There's no problem. Databases are not going to cover the same thing. The problem here is what's in pink. So the pink is the items that appear in the database that one place is indexed as retracted, maybe many, but someplace else has not. And so if we look at these items that at least one place says are retracted, 7%, every place agrees. And so there's just this wild disagreement. And so no wonder authors can't get it right? The databases are not getting it right. Lots of work to be done there. So this is work that we're doing with Sloan, and also some funding from an existing grant that I had from the National Science Foundation to track this. My goal is to track this longitudinally over time. We hope that after the NISO guidance gets more widely adopted, that going forward that this should improve. And also, of course, it's only since September 2023 that Retraction Watch data is openly available, CC0 licensed in a way anybody can use for whatever they want. But this is, again, still part of the problem. All right, next. So that brings us to the whole goal here is to really draw your attention to citation integrity. And we have some examples to look at. What can authors do, right? And so I would really encourage you. You are folks who are thinking about research integrity. Try to raise the profile of citation integrity. And one of the things we can do is, as we talk to people, talk about what's actionable. And so what authors can do is cite the best available evidence. Do not cite a 5-sentence letter as evidence, right? It's not, right? It's not. Ideally, you can use software to manage references. There's a lot of software these days that is checking for retracted publications. There are also recommendations to use author date citations when you prepare a manuscript. That you may need to put things in Vancouver or something, 1, 2, 3, etc. You don't need to do that when you're writing it. It's much easier to keep track of who the authors are. And this is from the Pavlovic in the bottom. When you are publishing, check for the most recent version, especially when you're dealing with preprints, online first articles, abstracts, things like this. Get 2 authors to check each citation. Really be critical and reflective about citations. And as tools like the NLP work, that Halil was discussing is making things available, test and use automated tools that may help. Halil, you want to talk about PIs?
Sure. So Pavlovich also had some recommendations for improving citation integrity from the perspective of PIs, and we agree with these, so we want to put them out there as well. Reflecting about best practices for citation in the field. So each field might have slight differences in how citations are made, but thinking about that and thinking about what is the best way of doing this for improving citation integrity is important. Teaching about citations to the folks that you're managing, supervising, advising in your lab is certainly important as well. And again, as hopefully there's going to be more automated tools that can help you with this process, writing good citations or including the correct citations. So learning more about those would be helpful as well. And that's really the end of our talk. And we'll be happy to take any questions you might have. And we also provide the email addresses for both of us in case you want to reach us. Thank you.